Learning occurs in steps or stages, and when learning something new on your own, which is how most of us online learners gain information, it can be quite frustrating. In this sub-series, with Hand and Chisel, I hope to break out just joinery so you can learn a fundamental technique to use in any project you desire. The series starts with what I consider to be the best first joint to learn. Its process is very forgiving, and the end product is a flexible joint that looks good, works well, and is very durable. It will allow you to make some truly fine projects, from boxes to built-ins, with just a few inexpensive tools and a little practice. Finger joint has been around since probably the cavemen started stacking sticks. It's basically just one stick over another interlocked. It became really popular once woodworking became mechanized because they could cheaply mass produce containers. Commonly you would see them in containers such as beer cases or even a small box like this. The advantage of the design is it offers lots of long grain to long grain adhesion area, so the glue would really work well. The problem was that there was no mechanical fastener. These boards could just come apart at any time. To get a mechanical lock in this joint, we basically need to turn to the orient. They basically cross peg their joints. This gives it a mechanical lock. By having these two cross pegs going into it, prevent this piece of wood from moving this way. These two cross pegs prevent this piece of wood from moving that way. So even with the very subpar glues that they were using in the orient, this is a really strong joint. Now I'm going to quickly kind of summarize what I know about this style of joinery. I've gleaned it from magazines and books and stuff like that, and I haven't taken the time to go back and reference it. I know it's being a bad researcher, but you can take it with all that I'm about to say with a grain of salt. Basically, the Greene brothers were architects that also designed furniture. They built houses and furniture together to create kind of a uniform thing. Before the arts and crafts movement, they had a line of traditional furniture that they were competing with everybody else. They weren't that successful. So the head Greene brother went to Japan and he looked around at a lot of the Oriental styles. And he saw the joinery that they were using. He liked the idea that they were using the joinery as an aesthetic aspect of it, the furniture and architecture, and not hiding it. Because basically, in construction, it would save money. You don't have to have the covers. You can feature right then and there. Less cuts, less material, even less highly skilled craftsmen, I would hate to say. When the Greene brothers came back, he talked with the Hall brothers, who were actually the builders and the people that he subcontracted the furniture making for. He talked about their design. They liked it too, and they wanted to modify it to make it even easier for manufacturing. Here's what the general idea was. A lot of the Greene and Greene style and craftsman style furniture has this idea of layers. Now, this is one thing I really like. I think it's brilliant marketing. Okay, the layers created these nice shadow lines and stuff like that, and you could round corners all over the place, creating deeper shadow lines. But here's an advantage: you no longer have to have things precisely flush when you have these layers. So a craftsman, if he was a half a millimeter off, no big deal. Whereas if you had to do it the traditional style where it all had to be flush, your fingers can detect a thousandth of an inch. So I mean, they're super precise. Plus the fact that a lot of the cuts are straight. So even though they were promoting in the craftsman style home artisans, hand cutting stuff, depending on less machinery, basically they would just batch out 1,000 chairs at once, cutting all these joints on a table saw. Then, if their measurements weren't even accurate, because they rounded everything, you wouldn't see the gaps unless you looked at a very precise angle. For example, this joint right here is not touching this one. And I don't know if you can see that with a light source behind it. It's kind of gappy. Okay? Yeah, it's still a very strong joint because of the mechanical locking of the cross pegs. But you can't tell that at any angle around it unless you were just right on it. Now, if all of these were flush, that gap would show up no matter how you looked at this project. So that's why I think this is one of the most forgiving joints to build, because it looks tight and it works well even if your craftsmanship isn't up to par. Additionally, the Hall brothers saw another advantage. These pegs that they like, in the Orient, they were wooden pegs that would go all the way through. But if you're mass producing stuff, waiting for glue to dry and all that kind of other stuff just takes time. So a lot of times in Greene and Greene joinery, the pegs you see are actually just plugs covering screws. And this isn't just a modern day interpretation to create the Greene and Greene aesthetic. They actually have x-rayed a lot of their furniture that came out of the Greene brothers manufacturing process, and there are screws all over it. Basically, with the screws, you could put the glue on, you put the screw in, and the screw becomes a clamp. And then you just put the plug on top of it, and nobody ever knows. It looks like a traditional joinery. This was for mass production. They were trying to make money with this style. And compared to the Victorian and all those other eras where they're very ornate, this is simple, easy to make, mass production, and it is very durable. So this forgiveness of the joinery aspect of it is one of the reasons why I really like teaching this joint as a first hand cut joint. The other aspect is that this is a great stepping stone to learning more advanced joints. Basically, what we're looking at is a dovetail joint minus the angles. So basically, you can work on all your measurements, your layouts, your straight cutting, your transferring, all that kind of stuff with this joint. And later on, you add in the angles, and you got your dovetail joints. It is also good practice for cutting tenons, because these are just like tenons, cutting the shoulders, cutting the height, length, and on top of all that, you don't ever have to really worry about making stuff flush. At minimum, you're going to need a very basic set of tools. You're going to need something to make layouts. So a simple square will work. Mine's a little 4-incher, and a pencil is just fine. You're going to need a tool to cut them. I prefer using a dovetail saw. This is filed at rip, and it's fairly versatile. You're going to need some chisels. I suggest having at least two chisels. One fairly wide. This is a 1-incher. That'll clear out the waist and clear up your shoulders and make them nice and neat. And you'll want a second one, the size of your square pegs, because you're going to drive it in, make them square, and fit them this way. You'll also need a mallet to strike them with. And you're going to need a drill and screwdriver to drill out the holes and put in the screws at a later date. I also suggest some glue, a little sandpaper, and that's about all you need to cut a joint that you can use for everything from door siding to floorboards to boxes to cabinets. The Greene brothers even have some very famous pictures of doing whole staircases with pegged finger joints. Now, this is the basic tool set. I prefer having a few more accessories. Instead of using a chisel to make square pegs, I bought a long time ago basically a square hole punch. Basically, it's a chisel with 4 sides, you bang on it. I also like using a coping saw instead of just chiseling out all my waste. And I like using a crosscut saw to cut the sides of the joints across the grain. Now, you don't necessarily have to have these two saws. I just prefer it that way. In fact, if you use a Japanese saw, more than likely you can use that same saw on both instances. It's just a little bit slower, and sometimes I find that the teeth get knocked off whenever you're cutting into really hard woods. I also will use a plane to make stuff, do my chamfers and such. And I really prefer using a knife instead of a pencil when doing my markout lines, and I'll explain that in a second. With this basic, fairly inexpensive set of tools, I mean, you can really do some fine work, and this is good practice, a Greene and Greene style finger joint. So let's get busy. This video is about learning a series of techniques to make a specific style of joint. The project you're using on is totally irrelevant. I'm going to practice by making a simple pencil holder for my tool case. I'm doing this because it's got 4 sides so I can show you different techniques and get some practice in. What I have here are 3 show sides of the box. The 4th is going to be against the wall, so it's irrelevant. Notice that I've planed the faces smooth, but the edges I've left rough sawn straight off the bandsaw. They're straight, they're square. Move on, because in the end you're going to end up leveling it out anyways with the block plane, so why duplicate the effort? Now, I am notorious for making stupid mistakes, so on every project I start out by laying out my wood and then marking the show sides and making sure I have one top edge, and then I mark out which joint is going to go with which board. This eliminates so much frustration later on, because when you're hand cutting tools, each of your joints will be slightly different, and the worst thing you can do is to fit one joint to the wrong board and then just end up cursing at yourself. I also tend to, on joints like this, mark out which parts are going to be cut off. This also eliminates some stupid mistakes that I tend to make over and over and over when I don't lay things out like this. Also, please note that this kind of joinery is generally cut into the end grain, so you'll want to watch that when you do your laying. The next thing you're going to want to mark is the baseline for all your cuts. Now, when marking cut lines, lines I'm going to saw to, I very much prefer using a blade, specifically a single bevel blade, meaning one side of the blade is a reference, a straight 90 degrees, and the other has a bevel. This is because the kind of indentation it makes, the cut it makes, creates a fence for my saw to ride on. The angle lets the saw slide into that. It really does make sawing easier, at least starting the saw and staying on line. So I really prefer using a knife for marking cut line. Now, when using a knife, you need to focus on 2 things. Which angle the bevel is going to. You always want the bevel facing your waist side, thus creating a nice 90-degree crisp line for your saw to follow. And you also want to move your ruler to the knife instead of placing the knife next to the ruler. That gives you a lot more control. Now here I am marking out the waist in the center. In this instance, I don't need to use my gauge to mark all the way around, because I only need to take out that center section. Now when I'm taking off the ends, I typically will go all the way around. This is something unique to just the Greene and Greene, because there's only one section I'm taking out in the middle. When I'm doing dovetails or more than 3 fingers on a Greene and Greene, I will mark all the way around on both the fingers and the tape. Now, the size of the fingers that you're going to be cutting are personal preference. Me, I kind of like the 2-to-1 ratio, meaning the outside fingers are half the size of the middle one. It seems balanced that way. Now, when you're marking these out, there's absolutely no reason why you could not mark them all at once. In fact, that'd probably be the most accurate thing to do. But in this exercise, I'm going to ask that you mark them all independently. Being able to transfer your layout lines directly from one piece of wood to another is an incredibly effective and efficient way of getting accurate joints. It eliminates any kind of error you might introduce with measuring. This being a joint of strictly 90 degrees is a great practice opportunity that will transfer later to dovetails, mortise and tenon joinery, and any other kind of joint where accuracy is most important. As I stated earlier, my preference when making key critical marking lines is to use a beveled knife. This is for 2 reasons. 1, the line is finer, and 2, the type of indentations it makes into the wood creates a shoulder and a slope for the saw to ride into. This creates almost a fence and kind of finger guards to press the saw against the line and keep it right on task. Now, when you're using a knife,
The traditional way is to place the knife down and then bring your reference measurement tool, such as a square or a ruler, up to the knife line. This means that this creates more accuracy, because putting the ruler up first and then bring the knife to it, a lot of times you get off a little bit. Now for this demonstration, I'm going to darken my indentations with a pencil line, simply because it's easier to see. But the center section, I'm going to make some layout lines here just for practice. And this is something I always do when I'm starting a project or writing the day. You've got some waste wood, you might as well use it to somewhat warm up. Now when you're doing practice lines, I use a pencil because it doesn't give me the crutch of the indentations of the knife to follow. It means I have to really work on my sawing skills prior to doing it. This also means that when I do get up to that final line, the final cut I'm making, that crutch just amplifies my accuracy. When making this kind of joinery cut which goes with a grain, you're going to want to use a rip saw where the teeth are cut perpendicular. Notice you don't see any reflections here. Where a crosscut saw, the teeth are cut at an angle, so you're seeing a reflection on every other tooth. Here's a quick experiment to explain the differences between the two. Take a piece of scrap wood. I've marked with pencil lines the grain direction on the board. Now take a chisel, which acts as one tooth on your saw. Hold it like a pencil and then try and mark a straight line freehand. Notice the work that's being done in slicing the board and how difficult it is to go a straight line when it's not going exactly with the grain. Now take that same chisel, turn it flat, and try and do the same experiment. Notice the amount of work you're doing. Notice the ease of creating a straight line even if it's not going exactly with the grain. Now do the same experiment going across a grain. Take your line. Notice when it's flat, it's doing some horrific damage because it's splitting the wood. It's going underneath the grain. Now do the same thing with it, holding it like a pencil. Notice how easy it is to draw a straight line. Notice the type of work and the efficiency of the work being done. That's the difference between a rip saw and a crosscut saw and how you use it. It all depends upon the direction of the grain you're cutting. One traditional practice in sawing is to always saw next to the line, whether it be the left side or the right side. Just depends upon where the waste side is. This is true whether it's a pencil line or a knife line. The reason why I like using knife lines is because the indentation it makes will create a shadow when you're a little bit off that you can go back later with a chisel to get it the most accurate. Like everything in woodworking, there are a lot of different opinions on the best way to make any one cut. With this little practice project, you have multiple opportunities to experiment with different techniques. Now, something I found out with all of them is they all advocate using both hands in sawing, using your free hand as a fence to guide the saw plate. So you will pinch the wood in one way or the other, register the saw up, and then use that as a way of controlling the direction of the saw. Don't worry, the saw teeth are inside the wood and your teeth are on top, so there's a little chance of you cutting yourself. The first technique that I've been demonstrating is advocated by a lot of experts because you only have to focus on sawing one line, the line going down. You basically lock the saw plate on the top line, flat across the top, and with your fingers. That way you don't really have to focus on that line too much. Just focus on following the line going down. Once again, register the saw against the line at the top, use your fingers as a fence to lock it down, then focus on sawing straight down. Now when you're done with this, I want you to notice the end results. Not only the accuracy to the line, but what has happened to the wood. You're going to find out that there's some spelching, a planing term, that has happened on the back of the piece. This is why you always saw into the front of the wood, because you'll get a nice crisp line on the show face and the back side will be hidden with the glue and the other piece of wood, and that spelching will just knock off. Now a lot of people really do advocate this method. Notice my lines on top are dead on accurate right next to the line, but the farther down I go, because it tends to follow the saw plate, If you're a little bit off on top, you're going to be a lot off on bottom. I'm not that good with that technique. The second technique gives you some more control on following both lines. Basically, you start on a corner and saw down the top and bottom at the same time. This allows you the control to adjust for the drift. And then once you get the top and bottom line in, you just straighten it up. A lot of people in this technique have a hard time starting the saw. This is because of the teeth are cut in a triangle, so the triangle of the edge of the wood kind of registers in, and it's hard to push. A trick is to use a chisel to cut out a small triangle so that 2 or 3 of your saw's teeth will fit on the plane created in that triangle, the flat part, and it's easier to start. And basically you saw both lines, and once you get both lines sawed, you flatten out the saw to horizontal to saw the back of it. Because you've already got a curve started, you know that back portion is going to be dead flat. There are a lot of experts that really do advocate this technique. Once again, you pinch one side, you register against your finger, and then you saw both the top and bottom sidelines at the same time, and then flatten out the blade to get the back of the saw. You're still going to get the same spelching, so you still want to go into the face. I have not really had much success with that technique, simply because I can't seem to follow both lines at the same time. My favorite technique is to basically lay the saw flat on top, register my fingers, and then I tilt the saw up a little bit so only the far corner is on the plate. Then I can saw straight across the top, following one line and only one line. Once I get that sawn dead on perfect, I will come down like the second technique, down the face of it, and then once I get that line sawn, I will straighten it up to the horizontal position. This allows me personally the most control because I'm only having to follow one line at the same time. Notice that as I work my way across the top and then down the front side, I have the ability to adjust in case I get off. Now if you're using a Japanese saw, you might have a problem using these techniques in that the layout lines are required to face you so you can see them. The saw cuts on the pull stroke, so you're going to get spelching on the face. The solution is to work the piece flat. That way you can see the lines and use all the same techniques, and the spelching will still happen on the back side. You're just sawing down instead of back and forward. Next up, we need to cover waste removal, and just like sawing, there are different techniques to accomplish this. Unfortunately, you really need to master all of them because they each have a different application. This first method I'm working with is called the knife wall method, and basically you're creating an indentation right where the gauge line was. I am using just hand pressure to start out with because I'm going right on the line. Now if you use a mallet, because the chisel is made as a triangle, it will tend to move the line farther inward because it is differentiating, equalizing pressure on both sides of that triangle. And if you have one side that's straight up and down, the other side that's at an angle, it will move that line. Next up, you just turn it over and using both hands, chisel it away. Once you've got a little bit of a nice line knife wall going, you can start grabbing your mallet and hammering it in deeper. That's because the knife wall will create more pressure on one side and it won't move. Now when you're wasting away the material, please notice I am using both hands. The chisel is probably the most dangerous tool you have access to. You want to maintain control as best you can always, so use your both hands. As you work your way down, you'll create a fairly deep V. Now the advantage of this method is it leaves a foot at the end of the piece you're removing. This is used as a brace, and you can go along all the way down. Most people will stop about halfway. There's the foot I was talking about. Now if you don't want to use either a knife or a gauge or just using hand pressure with your chisel to start out your knife wall right on the line, you can offset it a little bit towards the waist and use your mallet right off the bat. but notice that it moves towards a line. This is because you want it's trying to equalize pressure on both sides of the angle of your chisel. Another technique, if you've got a lot of practice with a specific kind of wood, is to angle it back a little bit. This creates a equal triangle entering the wood, and it will go straight down. And then as you get deeper, bring the angle up. Once you've got a little bit of the V, a wall, the flat portion will register it, and it has a lot of resistance towards moving in that direction. And you can just hammer straight down. And once again, you can start with a V. But there is another technique that a lot of people will use when they're creating like a half dovetail, where the dovetail doesn't go all the way through the wood. You will waste away some of the knife wall, creating a fence going down, and then instead of creating a V-notch, which leaves a foot on the end of the waist, just go straight into the end and waste it out that way. And you can remove a lot of wood because it is very weak going with the grain. You're using your knife wall to cross cut it where it has all its resistance, and then just leveraging up the waste wood. And if you do it that way, you can find out that it will go fairly quickly. Just hammer away. And because you went halfway in the other way, it will pop right out. Your last step is to just clean it up. One nice, easy paring cut to smooth it out. Now, some people will create a shallow V towards the middle. Me, I just go straight down. It's just a personal preference. The second method involves either using a bow or coping saw to get rid of most of the waste and then following up with a chisel. The problem people have is starting that coping saw. Notice I've got some side pressure and I'm starting straight up and down, and I slowly rotate. This allows a set of the teeth to create that corner. Then just saw across, staying off the line a little bit. Then come back with a chisel and chop straight down. This will make it a lot easier, and you don't have to offset to the line. Once all your waste is clear, now's the time to practice transferring lines. So be sure you get the proper joints set up in the right spot. Grab your knife or pencil, line it up so that your baseline is equal with the back of your front piece. Then making sure your bevel is in the right spot, meaning the flat is against it. Practice drawing your lines. Now, you want to do this 3 or 4 times. First a light pass, then gradually getting heavier. This will make sure that you don't let the knife wander due to its own curve. Now here I'm going to darken it up just to be sure that you can see it. Now I'm the type of woodwork that likes to do all my marking at the same time. So placing your boards back in the right order, making sure you get the right sides with the right one. I like to go ahead and do all of them at the same time. So go ahead and mark your others. Once you've got them all marked, make sure you're cutting out the right spot. Go ahead and do your vertical lines. Please notice that your pencil line is on part of the wood that you want to keep. So always cut to the waist side of your line. And make sure you don't cut past the baseline. I'm penciling it in here just so it's easier to see. Now here's another little trick I learned. I'll actually use my knife, because I used a gauge to cut it, there's a little indentation, to go ahead and create a small V on all the cuts. This is what Christopher Schwartz calls a first class cut. By removing a little bit of that material, it allows for a place for your saw to rest into. It also creates less resistance. Since the saw wants to follow its path of least resistance, it will stay closer to that line you created. Now you want to make sure that you verify the grain direction and choose whether you're going to be using a crosscut saw or a rip saw. And then just go back to the same technique that you preferred. Remember, I prefer starting on the far edge, sawing across the top to get that line straight, then sawing down to come all the way down. Now, once you've got far enough, you can straighten it up and the saw plate will follow the path. But once again, it'll stay straight on the back. This is just my preferred way of sawing. Then do all your other sides. I like to do all my rip saws first, and then come back and do all my crosscut saws at the same time. It means less switching of my saws. Again, using the same exact technique, starting on the far side, sawing across the top, then sawing my way down, and then once I'm guaranteed I'm on the line all the way down, I will straighten out my saw, which will cut the backside right on my line. Then it's just a matter of repeating the same process on the 8 other corners. If you're not right on, you can go back with a chisel and clean them up. And your shadow lines, because that indentation will tell you if you're right on. Now, I'm about to do something that I don't recommend you ever do. Using your fist to bang something apart together. It's very jarring on your ligaments, and you can have some carpal tunnel symptoms if you do that one. This particular one wasn't dead on, so I went back with a chisel and cleaned it up. Now, once you've got them all lined up right, it should be a good fit. To prove a point that this joint is good for even if you're loose, I'm running my saw plate down in to create a bigger curve. Take it all apart now, and this is the time to round over your corners. I use a pencil to tell me which corners to round over and which ones not to. You don't want to round them all. Now, using a chisel is one way to make that curve or that bevel. Notice I've got it angled so that the blade of the chisel will leave the wood before you get to the end. This will prevent spelching. Your blade will leave the wood before the very tip of the wood is cut off. Another method is to just use sandpaper. Remember, you want to be sure you are rounding over just the parts that need to be rounded over. Some parts need to fit flush. Once you've got it and you're satisfied that all your bevels are rounding and will hide any gaps that you have, now's the time we start working on creating the pegs or the holes for the screw. From here we move to laying out for the pegs, where a set of dividers in your eyeballs will make everything consistent and accurate. A Forstner bit in a hand drill is also perfectly accurate for gauging the depth that you need to remove material for your peg. Just drill in until the head of it, in this example, is buried, and I know I'll be about halfway through the board. You want to leave enough meat there so that the face of the screw, the head of the screw, will have something to bite into to cinch this wood down to its joining piece. Afterwards, you always want to pre-drill holes for screws. The Forstner bit has a little pilot, little punch thing, and that's a perfect spot to register your drill bit into. It's dead center. Just go through and pre-drill all of them, and you'll be fine. Once all that waste is removed and you've pre-drilled your hole, now it's time to square things up or make it into any other design shape. I typically would use my square to register my chisel, and going across grain, not going with the grain, I'll just push it down with hand pressure. Because the grain direction going with the grain will fail, doing both sides will end up with a very square joint. And I just kind of eyeballed it to make sure it was accurate. But this is more than accurate. Another method of doing it, I mentioned earlier, is I kind of prefer these little square side chisels I bought from Lee Valley. Though I know some people will use a square mortiser bit. Just register it and bang it down, and then wiggle it out. You're going to have to remove waste chips either way you do it, whether you use this mortising chisel or just a hand chisel. Just clear it out and you'll be fine. Following that up with gluing. Now, ingrain typically doesn't have much gluing adhesion ability, but go ahead and put some glue on the ingrain too. Just be sure that when you do it on the long grain, you do not put glue on the part that's going to go through. And once again, do not bang the wood with your fist to close it down. Use some kind of hammer to get it down. This is very bad for the ligaments on your hand, and you can they say it leads to carpal tunnel, or one of the activities that does. It's very jarring. Just use your hammer. Once you've got everything fully seated, go ahead and pre-drill into the end grain of the joining board so that your screw will fit and it won't split the wood. Then it's just a matter of screwing everything together. The screws will act as clamps. At this time, some of y'all might want to even out the tops and bottoms, When you do this using your plane, just be sure that you enter and leave each individual piece of wood at an angle. This will prevent a lot of tear out and it'll make it a very nice smooth joint. Moving on to the pegs, there's a lot of different ways to make a 1/4 by 1/4 square. Me personally, I made a plane for drawer bottoms that happens to be a 1/4 inch deep and a 1/4 inch over. So using that on any kind of board on both sides leaves me a waste wood that's about the right size. You can use a bandsaw or plane saw. More than likely though, you are going to have to finesse it a little bit. I use a little block plane and it works just fine. It's a simple solution. Once it fits perfectly, now it's time to cut the individual pieces out. And once again, there are many different ways of doing it. I'm just using a cheap little razor saw with its little aluminum miter box. Works fine for small stuff like this. Now, a lot of people will pillow the pegs at this time. Me, I will do that towards the end. And just a little bit of glue. Position it in. If they're a little bit tight, that's fine, because you're going to use a hammer and that will spread the wood fibers out and get you a nice tight joint all the way around. Now, for pillowing the pegs, I prefer using a chisel. I will place it bevel down and pivoting off that bevel, I will slowly raise it up, and this shaves my way to a 4-sided cone. It really does create a nicely polished finish, especially if you've sharpened your chisel right before you do this pillowing action. When you've pillowed all 4 sides, then it's time to make a really smooth shearing cut on top. Just wiggle your way across at an angle. Don't go attack it straight on. And then right after that, make one final smooth cut all the way across in one fluid motion. And this will create a highly polished pillowed peg. Now this project is pure practice, so don't be afraid to experiment. Use round pegs, flush cut them, maybe offset them at a angle so you get little diamonds. In the end, it's just practice. My version, I ended up with a little pencil box I just nailed to the wall on my bench. Well, that's the basics of the joint. I know I covered a lot of information in this video, probably a little bit too much, but it's a good start if you're just starting out with hand tools to learn a few basics. Some of the things we discussed was that when you're sawing, there are 3 basic techniques that I've found out. A lot of people like starting at the top, lining up their saw blade flat across, and sawing straight down. Another technique is to starting on the corner, sawing diagonal across until you hit the back line, and then rotating it ways down. My favorite way was to start at the far corner so that I could saw my way across the top, keeping an eye on it, then saw my way diagonal, and once I hit my baseline, I would just ride up my saw. It gave me the most control. Another thing we discussed was chisel control. That you always wanted to use both hands when you're using it as much as possible. That whenever you're chiseling your knife line, because the chisel is at an angle, this angle here and straight up, it would tend to split that angle, equalizing pressure on both sides as you hammer down. That is why when you're going on a knife line, you want to be off a little bit so that it comes up. Now if you're just using hand pressure, you can go straight to the line and then chisel down. Once you have a wall, that chisel will not have enough pressure to push this way, since you've already wasted away the wood on this side, so it will tend to go straight down. Also, when you're chamfering, if you angle it over off the side, to avoid getting spelching on the back side, you want to angle it so the blade will actually leave the wood first and you still have this wood supported over there. It's a good technique. Those were a couple of the big things that we discussed in this quick little video, or not so quick, depending on how bored you got. If you enjoyed this episode and are interested in seeing more like it, please subscribe and tell your friends. And remember, it's always worth the effort to learn, create, and share with others. Y'all be safe and have fun.